The war room of the Valaran Dominion smelled like fear, though no one would ever say it out loud. Emperor Vorath stood at the head of a crystal table that glowed with star maps, and his tall bioluminescent body flickered between shades of pale blue and angry violet, colors that every Valaran in the room understood meant frustration beyond words. "The Crest are building fleets on our border," he said, his voice deep and heavy, like stone dragged across stone. "And our allies have gone silent, every single one of them." His advisors shifted nervously, their glowing skin dimmed with shame and anxiety, as the holographic map showed red markers creeping closer and closer to Valaran space, like a spreading disease. Princess Salith Avanar stood near the back of the room, with her arms crossed and her silver-white hair falling over her shoulders like liquid metal. She was the youngest of the Emperor's 3 daughters, and she was the sharpest. Everyone in the court knew it, even if they would never admit it to her face. "There is one option left," said Grand Advisor Thylon, an ancient Valarine whose glow had faded to a dull gray. "The Terran Confederacy has offered a military pact, but they want a political marriage to seal it." The room went still. Salith felt every pair of glowing eyes shift toward her, and a cold knot formed in her stomach, because she already knew what was coming. "No," she said immediately. "Salith," her father began. "You want me to marry a human?" she asked, and the disbelief in her voice was sharp enough to cut. A human, those small, fragile, short-lived creatures who still argue among themselves about which of their tiny planets is the best. "They have the largest independent fleet in the outer sectors," Thylon replied calmly. "They eat with their hands. Military technology is surprisingly advanced. They live for barely a century, and they spend most of it staring at screens." Emperor Vorath raised one enormous hand, and the room fell silent. His glow shifted to deep, commanding indigo. "You will do this, Salith," he said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only the terrible weight of a father who had no other choice. "You will do this because your people need you to, and because I am asking you, not as your emperor, but as your father." Salith's jaw tightened. She wanted to scream, to argue, to shatter the crystal table with her fists. But she saw the exhaustion in her father's eyes, the dim flicker of his once brilliant glow, and she understood that this was not a decision he had made lightly. She said nothing. She simply turned and walked out of the war room, and her silence was louder than any protest could have been. 3 weeks later, the Terran candidate arrived. Salith stood on the palace landing platform, surrounded by honor guards in ceremonial armor, their bioluminescent crests blazing with proud light, and she watched a small, unremarkable Terran shuttle descend through the clouds like a gray stone falling through water. The shuttle landed, the door opened, and out stepped the most ordinary man she had ever seen. Cale Mercer was not tall, at least not by Valaran standards, where even the shortest adults stood over 7 feet. He was maybe 5'11", with brown hair that was just slightly too long, and calm gray eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He wore simple gray clothes, not a uniform, not formal wear, just quiet, simple gray, and he carried a single bag over one shoulder. No entourage, no guards, no fanfare. He looked like someone who had come to fix the plumbing. Salith stared at him and thought, "This is what my people's desperation looks like." Cale walked up to her and stopped at a respectful distance. He bowed, too deeply, in the style of a Valaran commoner, rather than a visiting dignitary, which meant he had studied their customs, but had gotten the rank wrong. And when he straightened, he smiled. It was a warm, easy, genuine smile, and Salith hated it immediately, because it made no sense. This man was about to enter a political marriage with an alien princess who clearly did not want him, and he was smiling like he had just arrived at a friend's house for dinner. "Princess Salith," he said, and his voice was soft and even. Thank you for having me. I know this is not what you would have chosen, and I respect that. I will try my best not to be a burden to you. She had prepared herself for arrogance, for human bravado, for the kind of chest-puffing nonsense she had seen from Terran diplomats on the galactic feeds. But this man radiated nothing but calm and quiet sincerity. "Welcome to Valarin Prime," she said, and her voice was ice. The days that followed were a parade of humiliation, not for Syleth, but for the man she was supposed to marry, and he bore it all with a patience that bordered on the unnatural. At court dinners, Valarin nobles talked about him in their own language, right in front of him, laughing about his size, his dull skin, his lack of bioluminescence. They called him the Little Shadow, and the Princess's Pet, and other names that were far less kind. He simply ate quietly, complimented the food and smiled. Warrior caste Valarin would stand too close to him in hallways, towering over him by 2 feet, flashing their crests in aggressive displays meant to intimidate, and Kale would step politely aside and wish them a good evening. Syleth watched all of this with a mixture of pity and contempt. She thought he was weak, that this was what humans were, soft, small, endlessly willing to be pushed around. But she noticed things, small things that did not fit. When Kale entered a room, his eyes moved first, always, sweeping every corner, every exit, every person, in a quick, precise pattern that lasted less than a second before his easy smile returned. He always positioned himself between Syleth and the nearest door, even when they were simply walking through a hallway. She tested this once by switching sides, and within 30 seconds he had drifted back to the same position without seeming to notice he had done it. A servant once came around a corner suddenly, and Kale had already turned to face him before the man appeared, as if he had heard footsteps that no one else could hear, or perhaps as if he simply always expected someone to come around every corner. These were not the habits of a farmer's son. These were not the reflexes of an ordinary man. But Syleth pushed these thoughts aside because the wedding was approaching, and she had bigger things to worry about, like the fact that she was about to bind her life to a species she considered barely above animals. The wedding ceremony took place in the Grand Luminarium, a cathedral of living crystal that amplified the bioluminescent light of every Valarin present, until the entire structure blazed like a captured star. Kale stood at the altar in borrowed Valarin formal wear that was slightly too long for him, and he looked small and out of place among the towering, glowing aliens surrounding him. But he stood straight and calm, and did not fidget, and when the ancient bonding words were spoken in a language he had only been learning for 3 weeks, he repeated them without a single mistake. Syleth spoke her vows with the mechanical precision of someone completing a contract, and when the ceremony required them to touch palms, a Valarin gesture of trust, she pressed her hand against his and was surprised by 2 things. His skin was warmer than she expected, and his hand was covered in calluses that no farmer would ever have. The galaxy watched the broadcast. Most considered it entertainment. The desperate alien empire marrying off a princess to a nobody from a nothing species. On the balcony afterward, while fireworks of pure light exploded across the sky, Syleth stood as far from her new husband as the railing allowed. Kale stood quietly beside her, watching the lights, and if her coldness bothered him, he showed no sign of it. Below them, a Terran ambassador, a stern woman with silver hair and hard eyes, pulled Syleth's chief advisor Thylin aside, and spoke in a low voice that was almost lost in the celebration. "Take care of him," she said, and there was something in her tone that made Thylin pause, something that sounded almost like a warning. "You have no idea what he gave up to be here." Thylin laughed politely and dismissed the comment as Terran sentimentality. He would remember those words later, when the galaxy was burning, and wish more than anything that he had listened. The first morning after the wedding, Salith woke alone. Kale's side of the enormous Velarin bed was empty and already cold, which meant he had been gone for hours. She checked the time and found it was barely past dawn. She told herself she did not care where he had gone. She told herself this was ideal. A husband who disappeared and made no demands was exactly what she wanted from this arrangement. But curiosity was a weakness of hers, and it nagged at her like a thorn she could not reach. Over the following weeks, she learned that Kale woke every single morning before the sun rose and vanished for exactly 2 hours. No one knew where he went. The palace guards reported that he simply walked out through a service entrance and returned later, always calm, always quiet, sometimes with dirt on his knees and sometimes with sweat drying on his neck. When he was in the palace, he was nearly invisible. He read constantly, pulling texts from the Velarin archives with a reading speed that surprised the librarians, and Salith assumed he was studying their culture until she checked his reading history and found he had consumed 14 volumes of galactic military history, 6 treatises on fleet logistics, the complete diplomatic records of the Kreth hegemony, and a book of Velarin poetry. The poetry confused her more than anything else. He kept to himself. He tended a small garden on the balcony of their shared quarters, planting seeds he had brought from Earth in small clay pots he had made himself. He spoke to the palace staff with a kindness that startled them because no royal consort had ever bothered to learn their names before. Salith found herself in an uncomfortable position. She could not hate him. He was too gentle for that. But she could not respect him either, because gentleness in the Velarin world was not a virtue. It was a liability. Then the trade reports came in. The Velarin Dominion was losing money, enormous amounts of it, through a series of trade agreements with 3 outer rim species that appeared fair on the surface, but contained deeply buried clauses that siphoned resources at compounding rates. 3 senior economic advisors had reviewed the agreements and found nothing wrong. Salith was reviewing the data in her private study when Kale walked in with a cup of Terran tea. He had somehow convinced the kitchen staff to stock it, and glanced at her screen. "That extraction curve is artificial," he said casually, as if commenting on the weather. Salith looked up and frowned. "What?" Kale set down his tea and pointed at a chart. "The variance pattern, it is not natural market fluctuation. Someone built a recursive siphon into the exchange algorithm. Every third transaction skims a fraction that compounds quarterly. Whoever designed this is very smart. But they made the decay signature too clean. Real markets are messier than this." Salith stared at him for a long time. "You read trade economics?" she said flatly. "I read everything," he replied with that easy smile. And then he picked up his tea and left. She ran his analysis through the Dominion's financial AI, and it confirmed every word. The siphon was there, hidden exactly where he said it would be. 3 advisors with decades of experience had missed it, and a human who supposedly grew up on a farm had spotted it in 4 seconds. She did not know what to do with that information, so she filed it away and watched him more carefully. The second incident happened at a diplomatic reception for a visiting Kreth trade delegation. The Kreth were reptilian, massive, and aggressive by nature, a species that respected only strength and viewed diplomacy as a game played by the weak, while the strong sharpened their claws. Their ambassador, a scarred brute named Vosk, had been drinking Velarin spirit wine all evening and had grown loud and bold. Salith was speaking with a neutral world diplomat when Vosk approached her from behind and grabbed her arm, not gently, not politely, but with the full crushing grip of a Kreth warrior making a point about dominance. The room noticed. Guards began to move. Salith's own bioluminescence flared with anger and surprise. But before anyone else could react, Kale was there. Salith did not see him move. One moment he was across the room, holding a glass of water, and the next He was standing between her and Vosk, and his hand was wrapped around the Kreth's massive wrist. He had not raised his voice. He had not changed his expression. His face still wore that same calm, pleasant look. But Vosk's grip on Salith's arm had released, and the Kreth ambassador was staring at Kale with an expression that Salith had never seen on a Kreth face before. It was fear. Not anger, not surprise, not the theatrical outrage of a predator being challenged. It was genuine, primal, bone-deep fear, the kind that came from instinct rather than thought, the kind that prey animals felt in the presence of something that could end them. Kale released Vosk's wrist and smiled softly. "My apologies, Ambassador. I believe there has been a misunderstanding. May I offer you another drink?" Vosk said nothing. He pulled his arm back, turned, and left the reception without another word. He departed Velarin Prime the next morning, a full 2 days ahead of schedule. Salith replayed the moment in her mind 100 times. She analyzed it from every angle. The speed at which Kale had moved, the way he had neutralized the grip of a species 3 times his strength, the absolute absence of hesitation, and none of it matched the profile of a simple farmer's son from a Terran colony. She began to investigate. The Terran public records on Kale Mercer were thin to the point of absurdity. Born on Harvest Colony 7, parents were agricultural workers, enlisted in the Terran Confederate military at age 18, served with distinction, honorably discharged, no criminal record, no notable achievements listed. Decades of a man's life, reduced to 4 lines in a file that read like someone had deliberately scrubbed it clean. She pushed deeper, using her authority as a Velarin princess to request his military service record through diplomatic channels, and she hit a wall. The file was classified at a level she did not even know existed. The Terran Confederacy responded to her request with a polite but absolute refusal, stating that the information was sealed under the Terran National Security Preservation Act. No one sealed the records of farmers. She tried asking him directly. She found him one evening on the balcony, watering his small plants with a care and tenderness that seemed almost sacred, and she sat beside him and asked plainly, "Who were you before this, Kale?" He paused, and for the first time since she had known him, the calm cracked. Just for a moment, just a flicker, something vast and heavy and old moved behind his gray eyes, like a leviathan turning in deep water. "I was a soldier," he said quietly. "I am not anymore. That is the part that matters. Soldiers do not get their records sealed by governments. Some do." "What kind?" He looked at her, and his expression was not defensive or evasive. It was sad. It was the face of a man, carrying something so heavy that he had shaped his entire life around the effort of setting it down. "The kind that governments would rather forget," he said. Then he turned back to his plants, and the conversation was over. That night, Salith could not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to Kale's breathing, slow, steady, controlled, even in sleep. And she thought about the fear on a Kreth warrior's face, and the calluses on a farmer's hands, and the sealed files, and the way this quiet, gentle, ordinary man moved through the world like someone who was always expecting an attack. She accessed a restricted Terran military archive using an intelligence backchannel that the Velarin had maintained for decades, and she searched for anything connected to Kale Mercer, and she found almost nothing, because whoever had cleaned his records had been thorough. But they had missed one thing: a single file, heavily redacted, buried in an old database that someone had forgotten to purge. It was not a personnel file or a mission report. It was a threat assessment, the kind that intelligence agencies created for individuals they considered dangerous enough to track permanently. The file bore a codename at the top: Pale Horse. Most of the document was black bars and empty spaces, but the classification level stamped across every page was higher than anything Salith had ever seen. higher than heads of state, higher than weapons programs, higher than anything the Valerian used, even for their most sensitive secrets. At the bottom of the first page, one line remained unsealed. Asset status, retired. Threat reassessment, unchanged. Salith read that line 5 times, and each time the cold in her chest grew deeper. She looked across the dark room at the shape of her sleeping husband. This quiet, small, kind man who grew flowers and smiled too easily and bowed too deeply. And for the first time, she felt something she had never expected to feel toward a human. The War Council chamber was in chaos. 12 Valerian admirals and generals stood around the holotable, shouting over each other, while the holographic map showed the unthinkable. Scifistories, a Valerian colony world of 40 million people, had gone dark. Communications severed, defense satellites destroyed, and the last transmission before silence had been a single word repeated 3 times. Kreth, Kreth, Kreth. They hit the orbital stations first, Admiral Venus said, her bioluminescence flickering with barely controlled fury. A precision strike. They took out our sensor grid before we even knew they were in the system. How? Demanded General Rothal, a towering warrior whose crest blazed red with aggression. Our early warning network should have detected them 6 hours before arrival. They came through the Ashfall corridor, Venus replied grimly. A route our navigators classified as impassable due to gravitational anomalies. Kreth navigated? We do not know. The shouting resumed. Blame flew in every direction. Intelligence had failed. The Navy had failed. The diplomatic corps had failed. And at the center of it all, Emperor Vorath sat with his glow dimming to a sickly gray blue, looking like a man watching his legacy crumble in real time. Salith stood near her father, her mind racing. She had spent the last weeks digging into every scrap of information she could find about the codename Pale Horse, and she had found fragments, whispered references in alien intelligence databases, redacted footnotes in historical analyses of the Terran expansion wars, a single line in a Kreth military manual that read, "If you encounter the Pale Horse, do not engage. Retreat immediately and report to High Command." She had not confronted Kale about what she had found. She had not known how to begin that conversation. "Are you a myth?" seemed like a strange thing to ask one's husband over breakfast. But now, with a colony world burning and her people's military leadership dissolving into finger-pointing, she found that the question no longer seemed strange at all. Kale sat in the corner of the War Council chamber. He was technically allowed to be there, as Prince Consort, though everyone ignored him. He sat quietly with his hands folded in his lap, watching the hollow map with those calm gray eyes, and Salith noticed that his gaze was not confused or overwhelmed. It was analytical. It moved from point to point on the map with the precision of someone reading a language he had spoken his entire life. "Enough," Salith said, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade. The room quieted, not because she outranked the military leaders, but because her tone carried an authority that surprised even her. "We need a strategy, not a blame assignment." Admiral Phanes nodded reluctantly. "Agreed, Princess, but our strategic models show no viable counter-deployment. The Kreth have positioned themselves perfectly. Every response we simulate results in unacceptable losses." Salith turned to the corner of the room where her husband sat like a ghost everyone had agreed not to see. "Kale," she said. Every head turned. Expressions ranged from confusion to insult. A princess asking a human for military input was like asking a child to perform surgery. Kale looked up. His face showed nothing, but his eyes, she saw it now. That deep current moving beneath the surface, that vast thing she had glimpsed on the balcony, shifted slightly. "What do you think?" she asked. General Rothal made a sound of contempt. "Princess, with respect, this is hardly the time to humor." "I am not humoring anyone," Salith replied without looking at him. "I am asking my husband a question. Answer me, Kale. Kale was silent for 3 long seconds. Then he stood, and something in the way he rose made the room change. It was not dramatic, not aggressive, not showy. He simply stood the way a mountain stands, as if he had always been there, and the room had just now noticed. He walked to the hollow table, and the admirals parted for him without seeming to realize they had done so. He studied the map for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he spoke, and his voice was the same soft, even tone it had always been. But the words were not. The Kreth did not use the Ashfall corridor because they found a way to navigate it, he said. They used it because they seeded navigational beacons along the route 6 months ago, probably disguised as debris. Your sensor grid did not fail. It was blinded deliberately by a low-frequency jamming signal embedded in the Kreth trade delegation's communication equipment, the same delegation that visited 3 months ago. The room went completely silent. Their fleet at Scythari is not their main force, Kale continued, tracing lines on the holographic map with one finger. It is a fixing element, designed to hold your attention and draw your reserves forward. Their actual strike fleet is here. He pointed to an empty region of space that every admiral had dismissed as strategically meaningless. Hiding in the magnetic shadow of the Vaelrin gas giant, waiting for your fleet to commit to a counterattack at Scythari, so they can swing behind you and hit Velarin Prime's supply corridor. Admiral Venus stepped forward, her glow flickering with shock. How could you possibly know that? Because it is what I would do, Kale said, and his voice carried no pride, no satisfaction, only the flat certainty of someone stating a mathematical fact. The Kreth commander is using a modified version of the Thessan envelopment. It was a strategy developed during the Terran expansion wars. It works best against enemies who react emotionally to the first strike and commit their reserves before understanding the full picture. Developed by whom? Rothal demanded. Kale looked at him, and for just a moment the mask slipped entirely, and what Rothal saw behind those gray eyes made his bioluminescent crest, blazing red with aggression just seconds ago, go dark. By me, Kale said. The silence that followed was absolute. Salith watched as the realization moved through the room like a wave, confusion becoming shock, becoming something close to horror. And she stepped forward, because she knew that if she did not speak now, the moment would shatter into panic. Tell them, she said to Kale, and her voice was steady even though her hearts were hammering. Tell them who you are. Kale closed his eyes. She saw his hands tighten at his sides, saw the muscles in his jaw work as if he were swallowing something bitter. And she understood that what she was asking him to do was not simple. She was asking him to pick up something he had spent years trying to put down. My name is Kale Mercer, he said, and each word seemed to cost him something. I was the commanding officer of the Terran 1st Expeditionary Legion. Phylan, the old Grand Advisor, made a sound like he had been struck. During the Terran expansion wars, the First Legion conducted a campaign across 7 sovereign territories over a period of 3 years. Kale continued, his eyes still closed. We were undefeated. We broke the Thessan hegemony, the Drawl Compact, the Morvek Ascendancy, and 4 others whose names most of the galaxy has already forgotten. Alien civilizations called me the Pale Horse, the Quiet End, the Human who walked through fire, and other names that I do not enjoy repeating. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Salith. I retired, he said. I asked my government to erase my records. I wanted to be no one. I wanted to grow things instead of destroy them. When the Terran Confederacy asked me to accept this marriage, I agreed, not because I wanted to be a weapon again, but because I hoped I could be something else. The room was so quiet that Salith could hear her own blood moving through her veins. I do not want to fight this war, Kale said, and his voice cracked, just barely, just enough for Salith to hear the fracture lines running through him. But I can help you win it, not as a warlord, as an advisor. I have burned enough worlds, Princess. but I can help you save yours. Salith looked at this man, this small, quiet, sad man who had once made empires fall, and who now wanted nothing more than to tend flowers on a balcony, and she felt the last of her contempt dissolve like frost in sunlight. "Then help us," she said. Kale nodded. He turned back to the hollow table and began to speak, calmly, precisely, devastatingly, laying out a counter-strategy that dismantled the Kreth invasion plan piece by piece, and every admiral in the room listened in absolute silence, because they recognized what they were hearing, the mind of a once-in-a-civilization strategist, awake again after years of self-imposed sleep. Far away, in the command center of a Kreth warship, a junior intelligence officer named Sci-Fi was reviewing intercepted Valoran communications when he found a reference that made his scales turn pale. He cross-referenced it 3 times. He checked it against classified Kreth military archives. And then he sent an emergency transmission directly to the Kreth High Command, bypassing every protocol and chain of authority because some things were too important for procedure. "Abort the invasion," the message read. "The Valoran princess consort is Kale Mercer. Pale Horse is active. Repeat, Pale Horse is active. Recommend immediate withdrawal to defensive positions." Kreth High Command received the message. They read it, and because they were proud, and because they had already committed 3 battle fleets to this campaign, and because they could not believe that a single human could possibly be worth the terror that their own intelligence files described, they ignored it. They would not ignore it for long. The first Valoran fleet engagement, after Kale took his place at the strategy table, was a disaster for the Kreth. Admiral Venus led a task force of 20 warships into the Scythari system, following Kale's redrawn battle plan. And instead of charging directly at the Kreth occupation fleet, which was what the Kreth expected, which was what every Valoran commander before had always done, she dropped out of faster-than-light travel behind the system's largest moon, cut her engines, and went completely silent. They had prepared an ambush around the main approach vector, with attack ships hidden in the asteroid belt and heavy cruisers positioned for a crossfire that would have shredded any fleet coming through the front door. No one came through the front door. Instead, Venus launched 200 unmanned probes from behind the moon, each one broadcasting the energy signature of a Valoran warship, and the Kreth ambush fleet fired on all of them, revealing their positions, emptying their initial missile reserves, and creating a debris field that blinded their own sensors for exactly 47 seconds. 47 seconds was all Venus needed. Her real fleet punched through the debris cloud at maximum speed, passed through the Kreth formation before they could reorient, and destroyed their command ship with a concentrated volley that Kale had calculated down to the individual firing angle of each Valoran gun. The Kreth fleet at Scythari scattered. The colony was liberated within 6 hours, and the Valoran had suffered the loss of exactly 0 warships. When Venus reported the victory, there was celebration throughout the Dominion, but in the War Council chamber, Kale did not celebrate. He simply nodded, moved markers on the holomap and said, "They will adjust. The Kreth learn fast. We need to be faster." Word spread. It could not be contained, and perhaps Kale had known it never would be. The quiet human prince consort was not what anyone thought he was. He was the Pale Horse, the quiet end, the ghost that the Terran Confederacy had tried to erase from history, and he was now directing the defense of an alien empire. The galactic reaction was immediate and seismic. Alien news networks ran the story constantly. The legendary human warlord who had conquered 7 empires disappeared without a trace and resurfaced as the husband of a Valoran princess. Commentators debated whether it was a Terran plot, whether the Valoran had known all along, whether Kale Mercer was truly the same man or just someone using the name. The Terran Confederacy said nothing publicly, but privately, quietly, they began mobilizing their own fleets in a defensive posture near Valoran space. The gesture was technically neutral, but every species in the galaxy understood what it really meant. Humanity was putting its hand on its sword, and the next person to threaten Cale Mercer's wife would find out what that sword looked like when drawn. Old enemies of humanity grew very nervous, very quickly. Ambassadors were recalled, border patrols were doubled, and 3 separate alien governments sent private messages to the Kreth hegemony, suggesting, in the strongest possible diplomatic language, that perhaps this war was not worth continuing. The Kreth, stubborn and proud, pushed forward anyway. And so Cale worked. Night after night, day after day, he sat at the holotable and moved pieces across the star map, like a master playing a game he had invented. And every move he made was brilliant and terrible and precise. He did not command from the front. He refused to take an official rank. He simply advised, and his advice was followed, because it worked every single time, without exception. But Salith watched him change. It was subtle, so subtle that no one else noticed, because no one else had spent enough time with him to know the difference. But she saw it. The calm that had always been his defining feature was hardening, becoming less like a peaceful lake and more like ice over deep water. His smile appeared less often. His eyes stayed on the holomap, longer and longer, and he slept less and less until she would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning and find his side of the bed empty and cold. She found him one night on the balcony, standing in the dark, with his hands gripping the railing so hard that his knuckles had gone white. He was shaking, not from cold, because the night was warm, but from something internal, something that shook him from the inside out, like an earthquake with no epicenter. And he was whispering names. She stood in the doorway and listened, and the names went on, dozens of them, hundreds of them, spoken in a voice so quiet and broken that it sounded like prayer, and she understood with a clarity that hurt her chest that these were the names of soldiers. These were the people he had lost, the people he had sent into battle and who had not come back, and he carried every single one of them inside him, like stones in his pockets, and the war was making him pick them up again. She wanted to go to him. She wanted to put her arms around him and tell him it would be over soon, but she did not, because she did not know if it would be over soon, and she had learned enough about this man to know that he would not want false comfort. Instead, she went back inside and lay awake until he returned, and when he slid into bed beside her and his breathing finally slowed, she reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. He did not pull away. Their relationship had been changing, slowly, quietly, in the same unhurried way that Cale did everything. Somewhere between the war councils and the sleepless nights and the small moments of shared silence, Salith had stopped seeing him as a political arrangement and started seeing him as a person, a complicated, damaged, extraordinary person who had chosen kindness not because he was naive, but because he understood violence so deeply that kindness was an act of deliberate rebellion against his own nature. She respected him. She more than respected him. She was beginning to fall in love with him, not with the pale horse, not with the legend, but with the man who was fighting with everything he had not to become the legend again. And then the Kreth came for Velarin Prime. The alert came at midnight. A massive Kreth armada, 3 times the size of anything they had deployed before, had been detected on a direct course for the homeworld. They had committed everything, burned through their reserves, called in allies. This was not a raid or a strategic probe. This was an extinction-level assault. The Velaran defense fleet was out of position. Cale had warned the Admiralty 5 days earlier that they needed to consolidate their forces near the homeworld. But Rothal and 2 other generals had overruled him, insisting on maintaining their forward positions to protect the border colonies. And now, the border was intact and the heart of the Empire was exposed. The War Council convened in emergency session, and the mood was not panic. It was something worse. It was the numb resignation of people who could see the end coming, and could not stop it. "We have 14 hours before the Kreth arrive," Admiral Venus said, and her glow was the pale blue of grief. "Our homeworld defense fleet is outnumbered 4-1. Even with Kale's strategies, the mathematics do not work." "They would work," Kale said quietly from his corner, "if the fleet had a unified command. But your admirals do not trust each other enough to coordinate at the level this battle requires. You need a single commander with absolute authority over every ship, every weapon, every decision." "Then take it," Rothal said, and the words seemed to cause him physical pain. This proud warrior, who had mocked Kale at their first meeting, who had dismissed humanity as a lesser species, now stood before a human and asked for help. Kale shook his head. "No." The room went cold. "I cannot," Kale said, and his voice was strained in a way Salith had never heard. "I swore I would never take command again. I swore it on the graves of every soldier I ever lost. If I pick up this sword, I do not know if I can put it down again. I do not know what I become." Silence filled the chamber like water filling a sinking ship. Salith stepped forward. She walked across the room until she stood directly in front of him, close enough to see the war behind his eyes, the old war, the one he had been fighting against himself for years, and she spoke. "I am not asking the pale horse," she said, and her voice was quiet and fierce and sure. "I am asking my husband." Kale looked at her. Something moved in his expression, a crack in the dam, a light in a dark window, and she saw the moment the decision was made. It passed through him like a wave, and when it was gone, he was different. Not larger, not louder, not transformed into some mythic figure. Something in his posture settled, something in his eyes focused, and the room felt it the way every room had always felt it when Kale Mercer stopped pretending to be small. He walked to the command console. He placed his hands on it, and every officer in the War Council straightened involuntarily, not because they chose to, but because some deep animal instinct recognized what was standing in front of them. Kale opened a galaxy-wide broadcast channel, and when he spoke, his voice was the same soft, calm voice it had always been. But it carried across every frequency, every system, every ship in the void. "This is Kale Mercer of the Terran 1st Expeditionary Legion, acting commander of the Valeran Combined Defense. To the Kreth hegemony, you were warned. To everyone else, stay out of my way." The Kreth armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Valeran Prime system, like a storm breaking over a coastline. 400 warships arranged in the Iron Tide formation that had crushed a dozen worlds before this one. And at the center of it all, the flagship Dominance, a vessel so massive it had its own gravitational pull, carrying Warlord Draxus himself. Draxus stood on his command bridge, 9 feet of scaled muscle and predatory instinct, and he looked at the holographic display showing the Valeran defense fleet, a thin line of barely 100 ships between his armada and the homeworld, and he allowed himself a rare smile. "The pale horse," he said, tasting the words like something bitter. "I expected more." His tactical officers had briefed him. They had shown him the intelligence files, the battle analyses, the historical records, and Draxus had listened and then dismissed it all, because he believed what every Kreth believed, that strength was physical, that power was mass and numbers and the willingness to use them, and that no amount of clever thinking could overcome the simple mathematics of 400 ships against 100. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Kale stood in the Valeran Command Center, a vast underground chamber beneath the palace, filled with holographic displays and communication stations, and he was calm. Not the forced calm of a man controlling his fear, but the true, deep calm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, and who knew exactly what was about to happen because he had already seen the entire battle play out in his mind. "All fleet elements, confirm positions," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. But every officer in the command center heard him perfectly, because the room had gone so quiet that the hum of the machines sounded like thunder. The Velarin fleet was not arranged in any formation the Kreth would recognize. Kale had spent the last 12 hours repositioning every ship according to a pattern that his own officers did not fully understand. Clusters of vessels hidden behind the planet's moons, squadrons tucked into the radiation shadows of orbital platforms, small fast ships scattered in what appeared to be random positions throughout the system's asteroid belt. To the Kreth sensors, it looked like chaos. To Kale, it was a trap built from geometry and patience. "Let them come in," Kale said. "Do not fire until I give the word. No matter what happens, no matter how close they get, I need them committed." The Kreth armada advanced. They expected resistance at the outer perimeter, and found none. They expected mines, and found none. They expected a fighting withdrawal, and found nothing but empty space and silence. And the absence of opposition made Draxus suspicious for approximately 90 seconds, before his pride overrode his caution, and he ordered full acceleration toward the planet. That was the first mistake. The Kreth fleet pushed deep into the system, past the outer moons, past the asteroid belt, past every natural defensive position, and they did not realize that with every kilometer they advanced, they were moving deeper into a web of overlapping firing solutions that Kale had calculated down to the meter. "Now," Kale said, 100 Velarin warships opened fire simultaneously from positions the Kreth had not detected, and the effect was not a battle, it was a demonstration. Every shot had been pre-calculated, every firing angle had been chosen to create maximum disruption with minimum energy expenditure. The Kreth vanguard, 60 ships leading the charge, was caught in a crossfire so precise that it looked choreographed. 30 Kreth ships died in the first 90 seconds. Draxus roared orders. His fleet tried to reorient, to bring their superior numbers to bear, but Kale had anticipated every response. Every time the Kreth turned to engage one group of Velarin ships, another group would strike from a different angle, and the Velarin would melt away before the Kreth could return fire, only to reappear somewhere else and strike again. It was not a battle of strength against strength. It was a battle of a hammer against smoke. The hammer kept swinging and hitting nothing, while the smoke cut it apart, piece by piece. "He is hurting us," the Kreth tactical officer realized with dawning horror. "Every time we reposition, we move exactly where he wants us to go." Draxus refused to believe it. He ordered his fleet into a tight defensive sphere, the Kreth's strongest formation, one that concentrated their firepower and made them nearly impervious to conventional attack. Kale had been waiting for exactly this. "They have gone defensive," Admiral Venus reported, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. "He made a 400-ship armada play defense." "Because defense is where numbers stop mattering," Kale replied. "A sphere has a finite surface area. They can only fire outward from the surface. Half their fleet is now trapped inside the formation with nothing to shoot at. Deploy the asteroid belt squadrons and begin the compression." The small fast ships Kale had hidden in the asteroid belt, ships so small the Kreth had ignored them, now swept inward, carrying not weapons, but high-yield sensor jammers that blanketed the Kreth sphere in electronic noise. The Kreth could still fire, but they could no longer see what they were firing at. And in the confusion, the Velarin main fleet closed in and began methodically destroying the outer ships of the sphere one by one. The Battle of Velarin Prime lasted 4 hours. By the end, 260 Kreth ships were destroyed or disabled, and the rest were in full retreat. The Velarin had lost 11 ships, 11 against 400. But Kale did not pursue. He opened a channel to the retreating Kreth fleet and said in that same quiet voice, "Go home. Take your wounded. Do not return." He gave them a corridor. He let them leave. The old Kale, the pale horse of the expansion wars, would have chased them down and destroyed every last ship to prevent future threats. This Kale let them go, and when Rothal questioned why, Kale said simply, "Because mercy is not weakness, it is a choice, and I am choosing it." Draxus did not retreat with his fleet. His flagship was crippled but not destroyed, and as the battle ended, he broadcast a challenge on an open channel, a Kreth tradition older than their civilization, a call for single combat between commanders to settle a war without further bloodshed. The War Council panicked. A Kreth warlord in single combat was one of the most dangerous things in the galaxy. 9 feet tall, armored in natural scales harder than most metals, with claws that could tear through ship plating, and reflexes honed by millions of years of predatory evolution. Kale was human, 5'11", no claws, no scales, no natural weapons of any kind. "You cannot accept this," Venus said firmly. "If I refuse, the Kreth will consider the war unfinished," Kale replied. "They will rebuild and return, not in a year, not in 10 years, but they will return. This ends it." Salith grabbed his arm. Her grip was fierce, and her glow blazed white-hot with emotions she could not name. "If he kills you," she began. "He will not," Kale said, and she searched his eyes for arrogance and found none. Only that same quiet certainty, the certainty of a man who understood violence the way a poet understood words. The duel took place in the shattered hangar bay of the Kreth flagship, broadcast across the galaxy. Draxus stood at one end, a mountain of muscle and rage, his scales gleaming under emergency lighting. Kale stood at the other end, small and still and gray, looking like a clerk who had wandered into the wrong room. Draxus charged. He was fast, terrifyingly fast for something his size, and he crossed the distance between them in 2 enormous strides, his claws swinging in an arc that would have cut a Valerian in half. Kale was not there. He moved, not with speed that the eye could follow, but with an efficiency that made speed irrelevant. He stepped exactly far enough to let the claws pass, then stepped in and struck 3 precise points on the Kreth's torso with the flat of his hand. Draxus staggered. He swung again. Kale moved again. The same precise distance, the same impossible economy of motion, and struck 3 more points. The Kreth warlord's movements began to slow. His left arm dropped. His right leg buckled. He swung one more time with everything he had, a blow that would have shattered stone. And Kale stepped inside the arc of the swing, placed one hand on Draxus's chest, and pushed. 9 feet of Kreth warlord crashed to the ground. The duel had lasted 43 seconds. Kale stood over him. The galaxy watched. This was the moment where a conqueror would kill, where the pale horse of legend would end his enemy. And Kale knelt beside Draxus and spoke in a voice so quiet that the broadcast microphones barely caught it. "Go home," he said. "Teach your children that the quiet ones are the most dangerous, and tell them that the most dangerous thing of all is mercy. You are alive because I choose it. Remember that." Draxus stared up at him with something that was not hatred and not fear, but something far more unsettling. It was understanding. For the first time in his life, the Kreth warlord understood what true strength looked like. And it did not look like claws and scales and rage. It looked like a small man choosing not to kill. The Kreth hegemony sued for peace within 72 hours. The terms were fair. Kale insisted on it. No reparations designed to cripple. No territorial humiliation. No conditions that would breed the kind of resentment that started the next war. It was a peace built to last, not to punish. The galaxy watched and recalibrated everything it thought it knew about humans. Not because humans were the strongest species, or the fastest, or the most technologically advanced, but because they produced individuals like Cale Mercer, individuals who carried within them the capacity for absolute destruction and the wisdom to choose otherwise. Cale stepped down from command the moment the peace treaty was signed. He did not attend the victory celebrations. He did not accept the medals the Velaran Senate tried to give him. He handed the fleet back to its admirals, walked out of the command center, and went back to his balcony. Salith found him there an hour later, kneeling in the dirt, repotting a plant that had wilted during the weeks he had neglected it. His hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped. But there was a tiredness in him that went deeper than physical exhaustion. It was the tiredness of a man who had picked up something impossibly heavy, carried it one last time, and set it down for good. She sat beside him on the balcony floor, not caring that her formal robes were getting dirty, and she did not ask if he was all right, because she knew he was not. Not yet, not fully, maybe not for a long time. Instead, she took his hand, the hand that had moved fleets and toppled empires, and shown mercy to a fallen enemy, and she held it. And she said the words that she had been carrying inside her for weeks, words that were simple and plain and true. "You are not what you have done," she said. "You are what you choose to do next." Cale looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, his eyes were not calm. They were full of grief, and relief, and gratitude, and a love so large and so long denied that it had nowhere to go except out. And so for the first time in longer than he could remember, Cale Mercer, the pale horse, the quiet end, the most dangerous human who had ever lived, cried. Not from sadness, from relief, because someone finally saw him, not the legend, not the weapon, not the name that made empires tremble, but him, the man underneath it all, the man who just wanted to grow things, and be known, and be loved. Salith held him, and her glow, which had been ice-white with control for as long as anyone could remember, softened to a warm, gentle gold that the Velaran called heartlight, the color of unconditional love. Years passed. The galaxy moved on, as galaxies do. The Kreth hegemony honored the peace, and slowly transformed from a military empire into a wary but functional neighbor. The Terran Confederacy and the Velaran Dominion grew closer, bound not just by treaty, but by genuine alliance. And the story of the Pale Horse became one of those legends that every species told differently, but that all ended the same way, with a quiet man who chose peace. On Velaran Prime, in the royal palace, a small girl with her mother's silver hair and her father's gray eyes played in a garden that had grown from a few clay pots into a sprawling paradise of earth flowers and Velaran crystal blooms intertwined. Her name was Lien, and she had her father's calm and her mother's fire, and she did not yet understand why important people sometimes stared at her father with awe and fear. One afternoon, a visiting alien dignitary, a tall, nervous creature from a species that had been on the wrong end of the expansion wars, watched Cale kneeling in the garden with Lien, showing her how to press seeds into the soil with gentle fingers. And he turned to Salith with wide eyes. "Is it true," he asked in a hushed voice, "that your husband conquered 7 empires?" Salith watched Cale lift Lien onto his shoulders so she could reach the higher branches of a crystal bloom tree. And the little girl laughed, a bright, pure sound that rang through the garden like a bell. And Cale smiled, a real smile, the smile of a man who had finally found the life he had been fighting to deserve. "No," Salith said, and her glow was warm gold. "My husband grows flowers." Galaxy. The legend of the Pale Horse endured, whispered in war academies, and sung in alien taverns, and studied in military archives. But on Velaran Prime, there was only a quiet man, a fierce princess, a laughing child, a garden in full bloom, and a peace that was not given but earned, not by the sword, but by the extraordinary, terrifying, deeply human act of putting it down.